Good evening. My name is Finn Carter. I represent Dr. Ray. And today I'm going to be talking about some reasons why we should be editing the human germline and really what genetic editing is as a whole. I'm sure you've probably heard of maybe CRISPR or genetic editing. Recently, some things happened just a couple days regarding CRISPR and genetic editing. So what is genetic editing? Well, to understand genetic editing, one must understand the genome, essentially understanding DNA. What does DNA do? As you may know, it involves traits like hair color, eye color, height, several things. So therefore, genome editing is the editing of DNA. Now, genetic editing has been in use since about 1974 when the first animal was genetically modified, which was a mouse. In 1982, the first plant was modified, which was tobacco. People more recently have discovered that we can edit the genes of humans, and this is using CRISPR. This is, something you may have heard of. Now, what is CRISPR? Well, CRISPR was first developed in 1987 by a Japanese scientist to study the E. coli bacteria. Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, along with a team of scientists in 2012, discovered that it could be used to genetically modify people, or at least change their genes. So with that in mind, before I continue, let me get back to what the germline is. There are two types of genetic edits, somatic and germline. Somatic editing ends with the subject, meaning it does not pass down to future generations. What I'm focusing on is germline editing, which is typically done in a human embryo, which means that no matter what you do within a human embryo, it is a germline edit, meaning that it passes down to an embryo if they become a person, their children. So obviously passing down genes has a pretty massive implication, and I think they are good implications. So why should you care about germline editing? Well, when we're speaking about germline editing and really genetic editing as a whole, most people are talking about editing out genetic disorders. With germline editing, you may essentially eliminate or erase genetic disorders from the human genome. Future generations won't have to deal with these disorders, and it allows people to have children in situations that they otherwise couldn't. Perhaps both parents carry a recessive gene for cystic fibrosis. There will be a 100% chance that they will have a child without cystic fibrosis using CRISPR. Now, opponents of CRISPR argue that there already has been an option for parents in this situation, which is true. This is PGD, which is often used in tandem with in vitro fertilization, or IVF. Now, PGD, which stands for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, has been in use since 1989 when the first IVF baby was born. The way PGD works is you are given an array of embryos, and you are essentially told, let's say you are diagnosing for cystic fibrosis. This embryo will have a 10% chance of developing cystic fibrosis, et cetera. And in some situations, it is extremely effective to the point where there is no chance. So that's the gist of what PGD is, but I believe CRISPR can do this a little bit better. Like I said, with PGD, you are often given a chance of inheriting a disorder. It's not 100%. CRISPR, on the other hand, would be you essentially just edit out the gene and there is absolutely no chance. Another big problem that kind of rises from PGD is that you are picking embryos, picking embryos rather than just treating one, which could be deemed unethical in of itself. And that could be fairly traumatic to a parent who is having to, pick over several embryos, all of which represent potentially a completely different person. Another kind of thing that I think a lot of people in the US would deem unethical that has been used with PGD is using PGD for basically choosing the sex of your child. There's been documented cases in places like China and India in which they choose male embryos. CRISPR, you can't change, your sex. Furthermore, there are technologies that are currently being developed to further analyze these embryos. As in, with PGD, you'll be able to understand your potential baby's hair color, eye color, height, various traits, which kind of throws out the argument of not using CRISPR, the designer baby argument, which is probably on a lot of people's minds. So to get to the designer baby argument and why, really, the designer baby argument as a whole is somewhat of a myth. So yes, while designer babies are based in fact, it isn't as black and white as you can make a very intelligent and very strong person. Traits like skin color, intelligence, physical ability are all what are considered polygenic traits, meaning hundreds, if not thousands of genes are involved in your skin color, your athletic ability, your intelligence, which means it would be very hard to engineer a white embryo, which is, when people are talking about CRISPR, we're typically talking about eugenics. So, and on top of that, really, with intellectual capability and athletic ability, studies have shown many times that things like intelligence and athletic ability are heavily relied on nurture, how you grew up. If you grew up in an environment that, stimulates intellectual growth, then you probably will be a little bit more intelligent. But let's say you have for athletic ability, for example, one of you could have had, the gene makeup to be the best weightlifter in the world. Perhaps you've never lifted a weight, ever. You won't ever be an Olympic weightlifter. There's a huge amount of nurture involved with things like intelligence and athleticism. So it's not as simple as just making an intelligent embryo. So anyway, to get back to my final point on why germline editing is, I think, a positive thing, is that with the elimination of genetic disorders comes a large amount of money for us in our healthcare system. So I just have two examples here. Cystic fibrosis, there are 30,000 people affected with cystic fibrosis in the United States. It costs $1.1 billion per year. Hemophilia, with 20,000 people affected in the United States, costs $100,000 to $350,000 per year per person. This is a massive amount of money for 50,000 people, and this is only two disorders. Another example for hemophilia, in Portugal, there are 800 people affected with hemophilia. It accounts for 4.4% of their healthcare costs. That's a lot. So there's this huge monetary, kind of incentive to edit out these genetic disorders. And this isn't just, I'm glossing over the fact that a lot of these disorders, and this brings me to my conclusion, a lot of these disorders really are somewhat terrible. So with more research, CRISPR could provide the end of suffering from genetic disorder. Genetic disorders like cystic fibrosis, you have an average lifespan of 37 years old. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, average lifespan of 27. I know someone with cystic fibrosis. He spends 2 months a year in the hospital getting his lungs pumped, and he knows he's going to die in 10 years. I think if we had the capability to eliminate these disorders, I would argue that it's almost unethical not to. Further, it provides a viable option for parents, over PGD, and it allows more money for healthcare. And that's all I have for you guys. Thank you very much. I'd be willing to take questions.
There must be repercussions to removing a part of your genome. What are some of the arguments that have come up in your study?
The main argument right now is that we simply don't know enough. There must be some repercussions. We simply don't know if there will be repercussions. So I should have clarified a little bit more. I'm not arguing right now we should be genetically altering all the babies. In fact, I'm arguing against that in the end, because that's kind of we simply don't know enough. I don't know if you've heard, but just a couple days ago, a person in China claims that, and I'm not sure, there hasn't been a whole lot of evidence. To me, it kind of sounds like a hoax, but he at least claims to have edited 2 embryos and birthed them to be resistant to HIV. The huge backlash is essentially that what could happen to them. They didn't really edit anything insane. It's just a gene for HIV resistance, but we simply don't have any idea right now. there needs to be much more research. CRISPR is a much easier, and it's essentially, there have been ways to genetically edit in the past, and I don't know I didn't focus on the actual science behind how it's done, but from what I've gathered, CRISPR is essentially like almost a do-it-at-home kind of like level of
Right,
easiness.
that was the method that.
Yeah, yes, they did use CRISPR for that. Yeah. Anything else? Cool. Thank you very much.